So thank you, Joseph, for your time today. I was wondering if we could start by talking about the new arrangement at the Bosch Gallery at the Prado Museum. So dominating the left-hand side from the entrance is the garden triptych. Directly opposite is the small Temptations of Saint Anthony that the Prado has. If you stand and observe from the entrance, you'll notice, of course, everyone crowding around the garden, pointing and commenting on mostly the center and right panels. I would say almost morbidly so. The Saint Anthony, meanwhile, is mostly, if not entirely, ignored. This seems to be an unintentional, ironic statement in a way. The Saint Anthony depicting the rejection of the sensorial world, of the sensual world for the sake of salvation, while the overly sensual garden generates morbid attention. What might that tell us about how different things are if we contrasted that with how Bosch's artwork would have been received in his day?
Yes, that's a really interesting observation, and certainly one that I think were Bosch to be on another screen on a Zoom, if we could zoom back to 1515 when he was still alive, but looking back at his oeuvre, what he would have to say. First of all, we do know from the year after his death, he dies in 1516, and an Italian visitor comes in 1517 and describes, without naming its artist, a series of panels with diverse disparities, with diverse strange images, some of which accord with the central panel. And he says that you have to see it to believe it. It's impossible to describe. It's so weird and wonderful. But from that description, a couple things arise. One is that he notices it, this guy Antonio de Beatis, but also that the context for the work was a princely art collection, which included some nudes by Hassart, another Netherlandish painter of a slightly later generation, erotic nudes. There was a Judgment of Paris. There were also strange, what would have been seen as wondrous objects, a meteorite which had almost hit the Duke that was on display, and a bed which was famous in the time, and even the German artist Albrecht Durer remarks about it, a bed that could hold something like 40 drunk people, who would be thrown into the bed when they were dead drunk. And so you can imagine a sort of wonder, something to do with revelry, festivity, and in the midst of all of this, the Garden of Delights. And the picture was set up, I would say, and you can't do that, unfortunately, in a current museological situation, was set up to contrast a kind of drab but foreboding introduction in the form of its closed state, which is painted in gray or grisaille tones, all gray. Actually, the technical term is semi-grisaille because there's bits of color in the grisaille, and you see this big globe which presses against the flatness of the picture plane as if you want to open it, and presumably that's the way it was. You'd see it if you just be passing through the room, say, when no visitors were there. But I imagine that when the visitors were there, some master of ceremonies would open up the shutters, and then we don't know what really went on. We know that that this visitor wasn't told who painted it, even though the name Bosch was very well documented and often stated in contracts at the time. So it's not about the anonymity of the medieval artist. And there was no title given to the work, which is annoying for art historians, because other titles were given to the works. We know from the description of this Italian traveler, such that rather obscure mythological scenes of Hercules, which one wouldn't know if you just looked at it, must have been told to him. So one has to presume that it was opened up and people were let let loose on the scene, rather like they're let loose in the Prado. And in the Prado, the behavior of people is certainly dictated to a degree by the fame of the work, just like the Mona Lisa draws everybody there in the Louvre. But in the case of the Garden of Delights, a provisional title, of course, there's no original title, it's a modern title. But in the case of this strange, I like to call it unspeakable masterpiece, the riot of detail, the vortex of people marching in a circle, counterclockwise in a circle, and then once you're drawn into it, the grotesque, as you described, details, especially in the hell scene, the semi-sexual details in the central panel, and then the sadistic details in the hell scene, all draw people in, and and that I think is an important part of the picture, and also in relationship to this St. Anthony on the other wall, as you're describing, is this riot of exceptional color, which is unlike any other painting of the Netherlandish tradition. These pinks and blues and pastel colors, this explosion of colors, which makes the work stand apart from other works, from the rest of probably the rest of the palace, and certainly from the gray exterior. So Bosch wanted a contrast between the gray exterior and then the explosive interior. I always think there's that movie, The Wizard of Oz, with Judy Garland, in which she's in Kansas and it's all in black and white, and she hits Oz and it's in color. That's sort of what is choreographed by Bosch. So when you put it all together, it was engineered for a kind of speechless wonder. It certainly is engineered to, and fulfills that engineering, to draw people into details rather than the whole, and to be in a relationship to the work that is almost autistic, I would say. That is, you can't really say what you're thinking when you're seeing it, because first of all, it's impossible to say to the person next to you where you are in the picture. You say, "Oh, do you see that that woman next to the strawberry?" And the person says, "Which strawberry?" "Well, is that a strawberry?" And by that time, the person's bored, and they're saying, "Well, look at this." So you're on your own in the picture, and you're drawn to it. Now, I think a programmatic reading of the picture, which I feel one could say with a certain degree of confidence is laid there by the artist, is something about the problem of ocular desire, the problem of looking and being drawn to the world, to the visual world, to the sensual world, and the picture makes you drawn to it, to express something about the way the human reacts to the world. And I feel confident in that, because the story that the open state gives is one of Adam in the Garden of Eden, not falling by eating the apple, not marrying Eve, who's already there. She's on her knees, but opening his eyes and looking at her. So he sees Eve, he blushes, beautiful little tiny bits of vermilion paint showing that he's blushing with desire. And he sees her, maybe in my view, for the first time, because he's probably been sleeping. He's seated, and he wakes up and sees Eve. And so the first libidinal desire is brought to him. And that libidinal desire, according to the medieval and Augustinian tradition, gets, by a complicated means, transferred to us as inheritance of Adam, and we participate in that ocular desire in the way we look at the painting itself, as it draws us to it in its brilliant colors, in its semi-sexual, suggestive, maybe foreplay-like details, and unfortunately also in the end point, which condemns us all. So that story is in a is in it when you look at Bosch's art as a whole, his output as a whole, his oeuvre, is in a very clear relationship to the other story which Bosch habitually tells, which is told most famously in The Temptation of St. Anthony, in which what the Christian is asked to do is to imitate Christ, to believe in Christ and to imitate Christ. And the way one imitates Christ according to the model of St. Anthony, who is the father of the monastic tradition, who's the first great ascetic saint who withdraws from the world, and he's an Egyptian figure, and he withdraws from the city where he's belongs to a well-to-do family, gives away his clothes in that typical manner. But he's the exemplary one, and goes into the desert, the Egyptian desert, which is a place of deprivation, no water, no signs of life, in order to reject the world and reject all the distractions. But the story of St. Anthony is that doing this so angers the enemy, Satan, and Satan's troops of devils, that they, in great multiplicity, they come and attack him in the desert. And he refuses to look at this mass of temptation and of terror, a mixture of temptation and terror. Nude, naked women coming to him and trying to tempt him, but also devils snapping at his feet and actually lifting him up. According to the legend, he was actually physically tormented, not just mentally tormented. But he ignores it all. So you could say that the Garden of Delights, in sum, causes us to enact the opposite of what St. Anthony does. It causes us to be seduced by the pleasures of the world, and also to be terrified by the activities of the devil, where St. Anthony gives the anti-image of the exemplary Christian who turns away from the world and turns away both from its seductions and from its terrors. And to, again, in the way that Bosch, even though he's known to be very obscure, is very decisive in all that he does and in his oeuvre. He represents that disparity between, say, the Garden of Delights as a kind of picture and the St. Anthony as a kind of picture, because in the St. Anthony, the pivotal aspect of the work, especially in the St. Anthony that's in Lisbon, is a reduced head of St. Anthony right at the geometrical center of the picture. It's really about the size smaller than a postage stamp in a very large triptych, looking straight out at us. So the joke of the picture is, and it's a cruel joke, is that we will not follow St. Anthony because we will be distracted both in the Garden of Delights and in the St. Anthony triptych with all the mess. And we won't actually be able to give away all our attention and only look at the thing that matters. Meanwhile, though, being watched by the eye of St. Anthony, which in another picture also in the Prado, the so-called Seven Deadly Sins, is put in an analogy to the gaze of Christ, who not only looks at us as a comforting agent, but looks at us as a judge in judgment, that we will be always seen in our activities, in our sinfulness in front of Bosch's pictures by an all-seeing God who is whose conduit is this tiny bit of paint of the eye of St. Anthony. So the two pictures are the two kinds of works belong to the same thought structure.
And one of the reasons why I thought that was really fascinating, because when I noticed this the first time at the Prado, I had just recently finished reading your book on Bosch and Bruegel. So I had all of these ideas sort of clearly in my mind, but when I was able to actually sort of see it play out dynamically, physically in the real world, it was a really fascinating moment. And There's a lot to what you just said that I think is really interesting, and we could maybe dig into a little bit deeper. One of them is this idea that they sort of play off each other, that they're sort of referencing the same sort of worldview,
Yes.
and one sort of highlights what the other one condemns. From what I understand, a lot of his work was lost through the iconoclasm after the Reformation. Is there any indication that these works would have been collected or exhibited in similar, obviously not in museum spaces, but in some other venue that would have allowed this sort of dialogue between the pieces to occur in his time?
There were two, or let's say three different contexts in which we know Bosch's pictures stood. One was a ecclesiastical context, a church context, that included some public altarpieces that everyone had access to who came into the church in his hometown of 's-Hertogenbosch. Another was a sort of semi-public space, which are in chapels, with radiating chapels within that church, and probably in other churches in the northern part of the Netherlands, where the work would be displayed, experienced, and you could say performed in relationship to the activities going on in the chapel, which include the daily celebration of the Mass, but also, probably more importantly, special celebrations of a corporate a kind of liturgical kind, for the feast day of the Saint John, the evangelist, because he paints these pictures of Saint John and also Saint John the Baptist, both of whom were important figures in the piety of his hometown. So there's a liturgical, a festival aspect of the works in situ, most of which indeed disappeared in the iconoclasm of 1566, which visited large parts of the Netherlands and struck not Bosch in particular, but many works of ecclesiastical church art in that part of the country, in that part of the world. But we also know that from a certain pretty early point in his career, we don't know the exact date, but one would assume from the 1490s on, his work was collected by the highest level of aristocrats in the culture, because of the peculiarity of his art. People appreciated its bizarre aspect, appreciated especially the representation of hell and Saint Anthony and judgment, and they collected works for constellations of artifacts, which eventually, and it doesn't have that name around 1500, but eventually gets called an art and wonder cabinet, a princely assemblage of objects, some of which are artifacts, some of which are antiquities, and actually some of which are natural artifacts, as they were understood, shells and minerals and strange formations, unicorn horns, which were, of course, narwhal horn tusks, all this that belonged to a growing assemblage of exotic things, in which the more rare they were, or the more well-made they were, rarity and well-made both got understood under the same category, which was called curiositas, curiosities. And so Bosch's work also would have been collected under the rubric and understood sometimes under the rubric of a curiosity. So both a warning, an admonition, a Christian altarpiece, but also a curiosity. And in these curiosity cabinets, we don't know how people behaved, but I think we could imagine them as arenas of conversation in which objects of different kinds come together in a social setting managed by the owner, the patrician owner, and that probably existing along a spectrum from a sort of crude look at this, the bed, excuse me, the bed that holds all these people, or the meteorite that almost killed the Duke, to the kinds of conversations which we know happened because they were recorded and published a little bit later amongst humanists. And we know this because humanists looked at art objects, and they particularly collected some artists very programmatically, like Albrecht Durer. So we know that humanists would look at a Durer and remark on it, how well made it was, and write the beginnings of a kind of interpretation of them. So we don't have anything like that for Hieronymus Bosch until around 1560. So we're talking about 40 years after his work, an amazing text, a Spanish text by the son of a person who would have collected Bosch during the artist's life. So there's a kind of direct relationship. But there we have a full-scale, very plausible and quite important interpretation of Bosch, that he's an artist, a moralist. His paintings are ethical. They are also fantastical. And they are also already, this person reports, being copied by forgers who try to make the pictures look old by, quote unquote, smoking them. So you have a lot of information there. You have the fact that collecting Bosch was already so widespread that you would have a culture of copying, and that the question of original versus copy already was there. So there's connoisseurship, and then there's interpretation. That basically you're in the modern world of art collecting. I suspect if you would put it into historical context, there is a big disparity between a modern museum like the Prado and an early modern curiosity cabinet, by virtue of the fact that there are no mineral collections. These have been separated. In Vienna, for example, the separation was programmatic and made in the 19th century between the Natural History Museum on one side of the giant square in Vienna and the Art History Museum, as it was already called, the Kunsthistorisches Museum on the other half. You pull them apart, and the museum kind of clarifies what is art and what is nature. But current museological practice has a slight nostalgia for the curiosity cabinet. Wes Anderson, for example, came to the Kunsthistorisches Museum and did a series of kind of kooky but fun assemblages of natural objects and art objects, rather associative. So you can see a nostalgia for that mode, at least as we imagine it, a way of experiencing artifacts that is spontaneous, that looks a little bit like what will be thought of as art appreciation, but had elements that were maybe different from what we think art appreciation is, maybe mixed in with religion, with religious piety. Possibly some of these St. Anthony's, which were in art collections, might have also been used for devotion, and we know that that's actually the case in certain cases. But also reflections on the nature of the cosmos. So something like a shell would have given rise, in one of these collections, given rise to questions about the order of nature, its perfect characteristic, but also what were called accidents of nature, which are moments, as was understood at the time, where nature errs and plays with herself. And this was both wonderful and also slightly dangerous. And it was in a relationship to artifacts where the human plays with itself. So the idea of play was very much part of the understanding of the curiosity cabinet, somewhat as like what we think art is. But the passions and how they were ordered around the appreciation of art may be different than ours. The valuing of curiosity is different. As I always tell students, if in around 1400, if I were to say, my son is such a curious, he has so much curiosity, people might have gone, "Oh, I'm so sorry. That's too bad." Because curiosity was a sin. Now I say, now if your child is not curious, it's a problem. But back then, it's good because Saint Anthony is not curious.
Right.
He's precisely, in fact, the word for what he represents at the time was apathy. Pathos, no pathos. Should not have pathos. You should be dead to the world. So being interested in the world. But Bosch is doing all this, I think, with an understanding that play is what these pictures are for, but it's a play that's damning. And that's what makes his work so, I think, really, really powerful, which is challenging and also historically distant, which is to say, he's at the end of things, he's saying all that you're doing is damning you, and there's nothing you can do about it. That's just the way of the world. You are the human is a bad animal.
And as I hear you describe these curiosity cabinets and what they were for, and also explaining the different contexts that he would have had his work shown in, I'm also wondering if it's also possible that perhaps he was also at the very cusp of a global change in which previous barriers and divisions began to disappear through global commerce, European expeditions around the globe, new social, religious, and political dynamics. And perhaps his work can be understood as reacting to that.
I would say if you were to kind of limit one's characterization of what makes Bosch a unique painter, probably that there would be two sides. On the one side, the thing that he was most famous for at his time, which is the creation of hybrids, creatures that were impossible to be in the real world, monstrous hybrids, which means, say, putting the head of an insect on the body of a bird with feet of a reptile, but wearing, say, a monk's costume. So putting that all together, and with that ability to create hybrids, mobilizing his imagination, and also mobilizing the imagination as understood in the period, which is the imagination was understood as this a capacity of the human brain and they thought about it in very physiological terms, to combine different sense impressions and to create a new creation. So he was very good at doing that. And he was good at doing that not only because of his imagination, and that's spoken about a little bit after his death, but the fact that it has something to do with the way he paints, the swiftness with which he paints. He draws with his brush, and that swiftness does actually not only mirrors the imagination, which is swift, it's very fast, especially in artists. Leonardo da Vinci says that artists have a fast brain, swiftness, but it's also swift in the way it's painted. Because when you look very closely at the work, the shifting between the bird and the reptile and the human is because you don't know exactly where you are in the painting. You can't do that if you're technically painting in a much more precise way. So that's the one side: the imagination, the hybrid, the swiftly painted creature. The other side, which is not much discussed early on, but became very well known when Bosch was rediscovered at the end of the 19th century, is his ability to paint giant world scenes. Basically, his contribution, we could say, to the history of European landscape painting. That is, that Bosch conjures a space that is more capacious than anyone had before. There are major predecessors, and he would have known them, and probably the most important in the North is Jan van Eyck, who conjures the whole world as tiny bits in the background of a painting like the Roland of the Madonna of Chancellor Roland in the Louvre. You look through the back of the dwelling that the chancellor is sitting in, seeing the Virgin, and you see this amazing view of basically Burgundy with the vineyards behind and you can see even the people harvesting grapes about 3 miles away. So there was an ability to do that kind of landscape at the highest level of early Netherlandish art. But Bosch's landscape spreads over the whole triptychs, 3 panels of the triptych. It goes kind of into infinite space. It brings in mountains, and I think most important to your comment, it tries to code this amazing, almost abyss-like space as actually world. You could say it's not just a landscape, it's not just background, it's world. World as it was understood in a Christian way, which was ambivalent. There's a famous passage in the opening of the Gospel of John, says that Christ came into the world, but the world knew him not. What does that mean? It means both the social world, but it also means the physical world. Christ was incarnated. He comes into the world, but the world, which is the social world, the human, doesn't recognize him. So it's got this moralizing thing of being in the world and what the world is, what the Welt is, what the Welt, all the different words for world would have been appropriate as a way of saying, oh, this is what Bosch represents. Creatures, sacred drama, terrifying drama in this setting, which is both physical and moral, the world. And therefore, you could ask yourself, what was it that was happening in the actual world, the historical world, that would recommend this widening horizon, literally widening horizon. I mean, literally the horizon way up on the top of the picture plane, all the way across, and showing distant mountains and showing water going off into the distance. And 1492, Bosch was in his prime. Stories of Columbus's landfall were making their way back. Before that, the Portuguese were en route to the coast of West Africa, all the way down the coast. The cities of Bruges, but in Bosch's time, Antwerp, were the hub of a kind of new global world of commodity capitalism, and in this mix, the people who Bosch came into contact were, a lot of them, diplomats from Portugal, from Spain, from Italy. So an assemblage of peoples from the ecumeny, you might say, from the Christian world, knowing that there are Ottomans at the court in Venice, knowing about the Ottoman threat. There's everywhere in Bosch you look, there's the fear of Ottoman invasion of Europe. So the idea that things are getting worse from a geopolitical point of view. And then the importation into this world landscape of elements that are, without question, avatars, one might say, of the New World, not as in the Americas, but a new world, a world which is being invented and imagined by Europe. For example, in the Garden of Delights in the Eden panel, there's a giraffe, which was taken basically drawn directly from earlier, very copied manuscripts, which were also made into woodcut prints of exotic animals that proliferated through Europe through various forms of visual dissemination. There's an elephant. There's a so-called dragon tree. There are unusual creatures. It's a little menagerie. And by the way, in the same town in Brussels where the painting stood, the triptych stood, there was a menagerie So there were a collecting of exotic creatures was something that princes did, most famously a rhinoceros that Durer made the woodcut of. But also in the Garden of Delights, you have very centrally and not much discussed, and it's been something that once I wrote the book, I thought I really should have done more with, which is the question of race. That is, there are white and black women
Yes.
in the picture, and white and black men, and with some ethnographic understanding, ways of characterizing the features, which suggests actually having seen an African. We know that Durer drew to Africans when he was on his trip to the Netherlands, and so there were black people in that world. But the Garden of Delights is imagining a world in which the human is the global human, that whatever is going on in that center, everyone's there. Whether that's a terrible thing for him or a neutral thing for him or a good thing for him, that's the kind of the interpretative crux of Bosch's work in the particular case of the Garden of Delights. That's what makes the Garden of Delights the art historical puzzle that it remains. Is it good or bad, the center?
And I sort of feel personally that the message is generally negative. Looking at that, and also looking at the other famous triptych at the Prado, the Adoration of the Magi, the which is also so beautiful in that sense of that world landscape that you just described, that he's so
fabulous landscape.
Exactly, that he's so incredible at being able to visualize. The idea of having these like two warring parties in the back behind the stable, sort of between the Christ that's being born and Jerusalem off sort of in the background, and also just the general sense of fear that a lot of his work seems to communicate. Makes me think that maybe, and this is kind of what I was alluding to, that he seems to be right in the middle of this, in the cusp of this huge global change, and he doesn't seem to be on the side of welcoming it. He seems to see a lot of fear and he seems to feel a lot of fear, and he seems to see a lot of risk, a lot of threats in this sort of global coming together, these barriers sort of breaking, and it makes me also kind of remember, as I was hearing you talk about the different references to animals and people that he has in the Garden of Delights, that a few decades before, Jan van Eyck had actually sort of done something similar, but with much less sense of sort of impending doom, in precisely the Madonna of the Chancellor Roland. There's lots of different sort of Mideastern motifs that seem to have been taken from southern Spain that was still under Muslim rule. And then there's the very famous use of the Valencian tiles that he uses in the Fountain of Grace, that the workshop uses in the Fountain of Grace, and then also in the polyptych at the Ghent altarpiece. He seems to be seeing these different influences from Islam, but he doesn't seem to be, at least in his work, he doesn't seem to be terrified by them, whereas Bosch does sort of seem to be afraid. And so I just wanted to also kind of ask you about the clientele that Bosch would have had. Seemingly, they would have shared this sort of worldview, this sort of conservative, sort of very Catholic, very sort of concerned sort of view. But at the same time, I'm realizing that they were probably also very rich merchants and also very much involved directly in these barriers being broken down. Any
Yes.
any thoughts? Any thoughts on that? Am I totally speculating here?
No,
Absurd.
I think no. It's a really interesting uh, distinction between Van Eyck and Bosch. I once, long ago, I gave a lecture when I was just beginning to work on Bosch in Munich at this Siemens Stiftung, a foundation, and I had as my commentator the very famous, now deceased art historian Willibald Sauerländer, and I spoke about the various ways in which Bosch was an artist of what I called enmity, of hatred. And he said that this couldn't be the case. And I said, well, why, pray tell? And he said, well, because he's a Christian artist, and Christianity is the religion of love. And so I said, my response, I was slightly taken aback. My response was, I thought, well, surely there is a kind of spectrum in Christianity, in the history of Christianity, between a Christianity that's centered on the principle of love and a Christianity that's centered on the principle, say, of fear. And there might even be a Christianity bound up with issues of hatred, which is of finding the enemy. You know, if you read Tertullian, most of it, there's almost nothing in Tertullian about love. It's all about the enemy and all and the idolaters and all the people who will die in some kind of conflagration. But then you have other people, other thinkers who share the same faith, but have a different personal and a different, possibly ideological point of view, and I don't think of, say, Fra Angelico as an artist of enmity. I'm sure you could find it, but it's not the first thing you think about, nor do you think with Jan van Eyck, though he's so capacious, compared actually to Bosch, that you have the most amazing representation of hell in Jan van Eyck's diptych in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, in which a sort of satanic figure is excreting the entirety of hell in a mass of tormented bodies. So Jan van Eyck could go that route, but his art and possibly his person, he was a diplomat. He was almost a princely figure. He was also the artist who kind of consolidated the way one paints, such that it looks almost like the world out there. It's almost like, and he knew that. That's why he liked to paint mirrors, because his pictures looked like they're not paintings. Suddenly, a painting didn't look like a painting. You looked at it and you thought you were looking at the world. And so that kind of consolidation, his personality, his elegance, he was the highest level person at court in the Burgundian court among the functionaries. Bosch also very relatively probably wealthy, but a different context, a different persona, different sensibility. But I would say the question you ask, which is one of how we imagine the public, insofar as we can call it a public, let's say how we imagine the clientele of Bosch to be. We do know that most of the clientele would have been corporate, would have been religious confraternities, paying for bits of altarpieces, confraternities including one to which he himself belonged. One has to remember that Bosch probably didn't need to make money. He was independently wealthy through his marriage. So he was kind of a painter, like a slightly aristocratic painter in that sense, though he comes from a long line of painters. His other clientele very strongly would be the highest level of the nobility at the time. Margaret of Austria, Philip the Fair, the consolidator of the Habsburgs, the beginning of the Habsburg dynasty as a world dynasty. Philip the Fair actually leaves 's-Hertogenbosch in order to get crowned the king, both of basically the beginning of the empire that will span Spain and Central Europe. So you have the richest and most powerful people, and then some of their functionaries, ambassadors, not so much even merchants. But in the case of the Garden of Delights, then the Count of Nassau, whose ancestor down the line will be William of Orange, who will lead the revolt of the Netherlands, the Dutch revolt. But these important figures, and for me, probably one needs to balance an idea of piety, which certainly flows through the commissions that were done of his work, public piety in the form of liturgy, private piety in the devotional context, which flows through the work and goes all the way to his most illustrious collector, Bosch's most illustrious collector, Philip II of Spain, which is the whole reason all of the pictures are there in the Prado, because he was an obsessive collector. And we know that he had one of the paintings, the so-called Seven Deadly Sins, in his private prayer chamber. So he's not looking at it for amusement primarily. He's looking at it, at least according to his librarian, for the purpose of a certain kind of piety. But when you think about the Garden of Delights in relationship to that big bed, and when you look into the character of the person who owns it, who commissioned it, either this uncle, the Count of Nassau, there's an uncle and then a nephew. Both of them were what I would call dangerous men, people who helped to annihilate whole cities, murder every man, woman, and child. That's not a kind of person who's very easy to picture as the clientele. We think of merchants, we think of pious people, but you have to imagine somebody who really like a dangerous person, and probably looking at the works of art in this dangerous guy's collection wasn't without dangers too, because they were even, it's one of the things that I found very fascinating, that that bed that I'm describing is part of a courtly world of cruel jokes. You get the lesser nobles, maybe some of the rich merchants, into your house. You give them way more wine than they probably can afford, and plus you force them to drink it, and you're the aristocrat, you're the count, and you're not going to say no to yet another glass of wine. You get completely drunk, you're thrown into this bed, and everybody laughs at you. And we know that kind of cruel sport because the Dukes of Burgundy spent a lot of money on these strange automata, these robot-like objects, which they had in their dining rooms, which would do things like spray soot all over the guests. And my view of this, though no record tells of this, I doubt whether the prince placed himself very close to the spraying soot. I'm sure that he placed the people who were slightly lower or people who maybe didn't like next to the soot, and then you'd have to laugh with gritted teeth as your one expensive suit is being ruined. So I like to think of Bosch's paintings also in those terms, as aggressive, and so it's not only warning. I don't see him as a frowning moralist. I see him more as sort of in tune with a certain kind of cruel, courtly mockery mixed with terror.
One of the groups of people that he definitely mocks, and you do a really fantastic, a brilliant job, I think, of explaining how he mocks this group of people in your book, is the Jews.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking particularly of the adoration of the Magi, which the way that you sort of break down the details and sort of tease out the nuances and some of the details that might not be so obvious all the time, but once you see them, you can't unsee them. I'm thinking, for example, how you describe the donkeys compositionally, the donkey's effect on that post that's bending the whole stable that's completely falling apart. There was definitely, at least seeing it through your interpretation of it, like once, as I say, once you see it, you can't really unsee it. It seems pretty clear that there is a great deal of mockery in that scene. And now, as I'm saying this out loud, I'm realizing that sort of the mockery and the fear at the same time is actually in display in that piece, because right behind that, of course, we have the two groups of Ottomans or foreigners in the background, sort of going at each other or about to fight. So this idea of anti-Jewishness in his time wouldn't have been something unique to Bosch. It would have been presumably something that would have been common, or was it like a more reduced niche within his like social circle?
The place of the figure of Jews in the art of the late Middle Ages is central. So, and I would preface this by saying that many people had never seen a Jew in their life, but the idea, the imaginary Jew, is present and made present by works of the visual arts. So, the most frequently represented scene in the period was the Passion of the Christ, Passion of Christ's Passion. And in those scenes, there are two things going on. There's the figure of Christ who's being beaten and tortured and mocked and finally crucified, and then resurrected. And then all the people around. And the people around, the tormentors, were from a very early stage, and because of a long tradition of saying that the people who arrested Christ and asked for his crucifixion were Jewish, that the Jews as a group, as an ethnic group, as a religion, as a however one describes how the people of the time understood Judaism and current Jews to be, they were the ones who killed Christ. They were the Christ killers. And devotional literature in the immediate orbit of Bosch, including a book that Bosch certainly had in his library, or in the library, a book published in Nuremberg, it shows scene after scene after scene after scene of Christ's Passion, with two dialectical, I would say, responses called for by the text that goes with it. Response number one, which is the sort of more love point of view, is to be devoted to Christ and also to feel penitent, because you see that the people tormenting Christ could be you, because you're not believing deeply enough. So it's a kind of penitent thing. But the other thing, and this book makes it clear verbally, and Albrecht Durer does as well in a text that he wrote, he published along with his woodcut of the Passion, says, and there's a certain group of people who you really have to be angry about, the Jews.
Right.
So, and people, I mean, it's very complicated what people of the late Middle Ages understood Jews to be, but in some way they understood them to be, first of all, a quote unquote stubborn people, because they didn't accept Christ even though Christ was a Jew. So the very fact that Christ was Jewish made them all the worse, because they couldn't even understand that Christ had come in the midst of them. And then the other side of it is that all those Jews who post-date Christ are not really Jewish at all anymore. They're part of a kind of diabolical culture, and the book that they write, the Talmud, is this sort of anti-scripture that's being written. And so you have this idea of an imaginary Judaism that is bound up with how piety was structured at the time, how Christ's crucifixion was understood, how moral responsibility is understood, how redemption is going to come about. What I would say is interesting from that point of view in relationship to Bosch would be that he is an artist who portrays a whole host of enemies. You could actually say that he catalogs enemies. So, for example, there's a painting called the Ecce Homo, the scene in the Gospel where Christ is presented to the people, Ecce Homo, behold the man. That's the term, and he's brought before the people in Jerusalem, and you have a group of people in the foreground, which, and again, it's a sort of hard way to move back from the present to the past. You could say they are racial stereotypes of Jews. The physiognomy, the clothing that they're wearing. If you look through the art, and people have done that, you would say this is coded as a Jewish audience, as it is in the Bible, which is that the Jews say crucify him.
Right.
But in the distance, echoing the same crowd around Christ is a mustering of people around a red flag with a crescent moon. So it's the mustering of Islam. So it's saying Jews, Islam, but then what about witches? What about poor people? What about beggars? In fact, in this period, there was a whole idea that beggars constituted a kind of counterculture, that their ailments were fake, that they had their own language, and that they were not only trying to steal people's money, that they were beggars and thieves, but also that they were conspiring to take over the Christian order. And lepers also. There was a very strong idea around the time of the bubonic plague that lepers were actually, first of all, so resentful about the healthy people that they were going to eventually infect them and take over, and that they'd be in league with Islam, that they had a secret pact with Islam and a secret pact with Jews. So it's that world of conspiracy theory and enmity that Bosch inhabits. And what's interesting for me in terms of the history of the imaginary enemy with Bosch is one feature of his work, which is, on the one hand, Bosch makes everything look like a figment of one's imagination by the way he paints, by the things he paints, how he paints swiftly, and you, unlike Jan van Eyck, you don't know what you're seeing. Is it a bird? Is it a plane? Is it Superman? You don't know what it is. And on the other hand, it's very concrete, because there it is. There is this thing that you don't know how it can be. And so the relationship between the concrete and the phantasmagorical is in this very, very complicated play. And I think Bosch is an artist who wants you to say that what you think is imaginary and what he shows to be imaginary is actually a real concrete danger. That he wants you to think the concrete, but for him, the concrete is probably of a slightly metaphysical kind. That behind all the enemies, behind Islam, behind the Jews, behind the beggars, behind the witches, lies the old enemy, Satan, who is actually concretely there and might be in us and might be out there. But it comes down to the making concrete of a metaphysical enemy, of a world that has always been, from the beginning, a fight between good and evil.
Which has its roots in Christian theology in general. That was the belief that it was
absolutely
that evil was a real thing in the world, a physical presence in the world.
Yes,
and this seems to be just not just, but he brilliantly manifests that sort of worldview.
Yeah, and it takes up the story of Genesis that Eve shall crush crush the snake at the end of time, as it were, underfoot. That is, that there's a kind of eschatology that goes from the beginning to the end, but the recognition that it's planted into creation. Bosch, by the way, is explicit about it, which is not in the Garden of Delights, for reasons that I think are particular to that painting, but in his scenes of the Last Judgment, and in this Haywain, which you refer to, which is a kind of moralizing Last Judgment, with paradise on one side and hell on the other, and something worldly in the middle. Eden, earthly paradise, has in its sky the apocryphal story of the fall of the rebel angels. So Bosch is telling you that whatever Adam and Eve are doing is part two of a story, the part one of which is Satan rebelling. That's the story that then becomes the long plot of Milton's Paradise Lost, but already existed in manuscripts and retellings long before Bosch. The story of a primordial struggle between good and evil, read, for example, back into the first lines of Genesis, of what was the deep from which the world was taken, and what happened before that, what happened before the Big Bang, let's say.
Right, exactly. And to go back to the idea of the anti-Judaism, I want to, if I may, kind of put you on the spot here and show you two
Go ahead.
images. One is from your book, and another one is from a Van Eyck painting. So let me just go ahead and share this. So the one on the left is from your book, Michael, Volmegot and Workshop, and then the one on the right is Van Eyck's, well, on my right, Van Eyck's Workshop from the Fountain of Grace. So just by sort of putting you on the spot here without having given you any sort of preface for this, what thoughts come to your mind when you see these two images side to side?
Well, the first thing I would say is thanks for putting it up. It reminds me of the golden days or the dark days of Zoom, where I had to teach in this medium day after day after day. And I always thought that of all disciplines, art history is probably the one where one gets some surplus value from Zoom, which is to say that we're both looking at the same image, but we're also face to face. Whereas in a classroom, everybody's looking up at the away, or in a museum, there's people around you. Whereas here we are with this interface. And the other nice thing is that the slide comparison goes back to the earliest times of art historical teaching in universities, back to Heinrich Wölfflin, where you have a Baroque church and a Renaissance church, or Northern and Southern. So the slide comparison, the one that is thrown up on you, is part of the sport, as it were, of art history. So a couple of things. One is, in both cases, what we're seeing in the Michael Wohlgemuth is precisely that world that I was describing, of an imagining of the Passion of Christ, where the artist, utilizing an existent literature, which comes actually from the northern part of the Netherlands, from the world of Bosch, created what's called the secret Passion of the Christ, where to the sparse history of what happened to Christ when he was arrested, between the arrest and the crucifixion, there's some lines that happen. He's brought before the priests, but theologians, and particularly one woman in the Netherlands, imagined what she called the secret passion. Something was revealed to her of what the Jews did to Christ between his arrest and the crucifixion, and in that imagining, all sorts of terrible torments are put forward, and then the Jews are accused of them. And this, what we're seeing, is not only that he's blindfolded and forced to wear a purple robe, and he's been beaten and all the blood is coming from his body, but also that they spat into his mouth so much saliva that if it hadn't been for an intervention of God, he would have suffocated. So that's the torture which we're seeing. Now we're also seeing with this drawing in watercolor on the left. It's actually drawing watercolor and body color, which I like to point out for the question of materiality, because the white of the spit being spat into Christ's mouth is made out of body color. It's opaque, whereas the rest of the coloring, including the blood red, is all watercolor. So the artist needed to charge his brush with white to make that spit, because you can't paint white in a watercolor unless you were to use an electric eraser or something, or reserve the paper. But he didn't do that. He does the white. And then somebody, earlier on, we were talking about what do we know about people's response. Somebody took a sharp instrument and jabbed out the faces of all the tormentors because they got angry at the tormentors. So if you want to say, did people get angry as a result of images? And who did they get angry at? Well, somebody who had this object, some collector or some student or somebody, came at it with a sharp instrument and violently struck the faces of the tormentors because they're reacting in anger. And the image maybe made them angry, and maybe wanted to make them angry. Probably didn't want to make them so angry that they'd smash the image. But it's a very interesting case that's not iconoclasm, though it looks like it, but a kind of visceral reaction.
Fascinating.
So that's the scene that we see before us, a kind of paradigmatic scene of Christ being tormented in the furthest reaches of the human imagination. If you think about it, like current horror movies or action movies, or you think about like John Wick, how do they torture? How are they about to torture John Wick when they finally capture him? Well, this is the circa 1490 representation of the worst thing that you could do if you're in a cellar someplace and people are torturing you, that they've beaten you bloody, and now they're going to suffocate you with their spit. There's lots, by the way, to go along with that. Very interesting ritual aspects. And then you have the coming in of the respondent, the viewer, who performs the anger that the picture is engineered to incite. In the case of the detail you're showing on the right, which is a detail from a picture, probably copying, I would have thought, a Van Eyck original. It's hard to say, and it's not all that important, but it's an Eyckian painting. The image of Christ's sacrifice as instantiated and repeated in the Mass, where the blood is represented, and the flesh and blood of the sacrifice is represented in the liturgy of the Mass. In Van Eyck's terms, will give rise through a theological and imaginative transformation to the idea of a fountain of life. That that Christ's sacrifice gives rise to a fountain of life because of how both at the end of time and for us individually, if we're believers, we can participate in Christ's saving grace. What we're seeing is that salvific substance pouring into the fountain, which is occluded, but you can see at the far left of that little detail, is something which is overturning this group of people who are representing the Jews. Blind because they were blind to Christ. Synagogue is always represented as either as a blind woman, here a blind priest, and they're coming to this fountain with their blindness intact, and they're being sort of pushed away. They're being both punished, they're drawn to and punished, and so it's a more schematic theological understanding of the relationship between Christians and Jews, rather than the picture on the left, which is more like a visceral instantiation of the enmity that the Jews had are purported to have had towards Christ, transmogrified into the enmity that the viewer has against them, and therefore against even their image. Whereas in the Jan van Eyck, it's more of a programmatic representation of the long history of Judaism from the moment in which Christ was not recognized through to the moment in which, at the end of time, the Jews will play a complicated role. They will be brought, and that different theologies come. Will they be? How do they relate to Antichrist? So it's a very, very complicated situation. But I think, in some broad sense, the Jan van Eyck is more theological. It's about the logic and the language of theology brought to bear, made into a painting, whereas the picture on the left is much more around the real world devotional imagination and practices of individuals at the time.
If I could ask just a sort of a silly question, but I don't have the answer to it, but it's one of the things that on a superficial level caught my attention when I saw both of these images. Where do these stereotypical hats come from? What is that?
Right, the conical hats. It's sort of like the creation of a stereotype is very hard to historicize, right? It's very hard to know how a stereotype comes about. Sometimes badges of infamy, as they're called, which were forced upon a subjugated people, become turned into their own symbols. So the most obvious of them is that Jews in the Middle Ages were sometimes forced to wear a little yellow ring to distinguish them so they couldn't mingle with Christians. And then all of a sudden, the ring becomes the symbol of Judaism, as if Jews like to show who they are by wearing yellow. And yellow is considered to be a color of infamy. So something that's imputed to, forced upon the people, becomes a symbol of the people, and it's as if it sort of naturalizes the Jew. So, in some broad sense, any form of exotic costume was seen as itself infamous in relationship to Christ. So the minute you have, for example, change couleur clothing that shifts between yellow and green or yellow and red is a sign of infamy because it's somehow to do with deception. Yellow, not a very good color because of some associations. Various ailments, disabilities are seen in this culture as signs of evil. And there's actually a fabulous book by Ruth Mellenkopf, Signs of Infamy. I think it's called Outcasts. It's 2 volumes, and she goes through item by item. And the conical hats, if I remember correctly, and I really probably should look into this again, but is a combination of fantasy and some idea about what priests idea about what priests wore in the pre-70 AD fall of the temple in Jerusalem. Some idea of what a high priest would look like, mixed perhaps with ethnographic understandings of what Jewish people might have worn, all turned into a kind of cipher, such that when you have a conical hat, it's just a shorthand for Jewish, just like a hooked nose and yellow clothing will be the shorthand for Jewishness. I remember, and as I'm speaking, that I once gave a talk about the very painting you were referring to earlier in the Prado of the Adoration of the Magi, where the donkey muzzle pushes against this supporting column, and it's as if the muzzle is exerting force. And I made the point that the muzzle relates to a stereotypical Jewish nose. And I gave this lecture in Los Angeles, and I got a lot of negative reactions afterwards. And I think even somebody said that that's a horrible thing to say. That I realized then that I hadn't done the preparation work, which is to say, I am not saying that this is a Jewish physiognomic characteristic, but rather that in the period, and you can show it again and again and again, when somebody is represented as having some Jewish characteristic, the nose becomes a distinguishing feature, a kind of attribute, you could say. But it takes some time for one to what I would call historicize a stereotype, because otherwise, if one says the stereotype, one's own discourse gets infected by the prejudices that are involved, and it's one of these. It's actually one of the interesting and challenging features of art history. Is that aspect? Is how do you describe something that's already prejudicially charged?
Right. It's a very tricky thing to do.
Yeah.
Joseph, I want to be very respectful of your time, and I know that we've only got 5 minutes left. So I'm going to just very quickly put both of us on the spot and just ask you for a quick response to something that I want to sort of suggest by sharing another image with you very fast. It's the result of something that I saw recently for a Bruegel family reunion that they had in Den Bosch, actually. And I saw, and I was thinking about something that you had mentioned originally in your Bosch on Bosch and Bruegel about the word disparates and how that was normally attributed to Bosch. And then when I read that, I immediately thought of Goya's very famous etchings series, also called Disparates. And so I wanted to ask you about this.
I just happened to teach a class together with my colleague Felipe Pereda on witches, and from the 15th century, when the witch was really invented, the modern fantasy. There we go. The modern fantasy of the witch, all the way through to Goya, and this was the heartland of exactly what we were talking about. From Bosch, that's the panel from the Temptation of St. Anthony, through a Flemish painting of St. Anthony in a kind of witchcraft world, to Goya's obsession with witches in his paintings and prints and aquatints. It's a line which is so interesting. Bosch, it was very well known in Spanish culture. He was almost a kind of cipher for the grotesque. Whether Goya saw any Bosches in the Spanish collection is an intriguing question. I think probably he did, but he takes all these ideas of enemies and of superstitions and of the imagination, and refigures them for understanding of effectively the modern world, thinking about war, thinking about injustice, thinking about the nature of humanity in this very, very troubled time in Spain at the time of the massive killing in the Spanish part of the Napoleonic Wars. And he reaches back to the via people like Teniers and the Bosches and Bruegel and those kind of people. Peter Bruegel has the foundational image of witchcraft and also of Temptation of St. Anthony, to stage this world of the imagination for a secular or a secularizing context around 1800.
That must have been a really interesting course that you.
It was totally.
I would have loved to have been there. Joseph, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks.
An absolute pleasure talking to you, Joseph, as always. Thank you so much.